I would like to open this session with hearing a little bit more about the different panelists' perspectives, themes. Maybe some of you have felt you already raised some of them, but maybe we could develop things further. I would like to start with Kim. If you would want to... also maybe we could devote a little bit more space in the second part for the aesthetic, if you want, musical aspects and stuff like that. And I have a feeling maybe that's also something you would want to talk about.
So, continuing from earlier before, I have written down my thoughts, and I will read to make my contribution here in a more condensed way. So, due to the large amount of interesting parts of this project, both music and text, I would maybe have preferred to have this discussion in a smaller room with plenty of time and no microphones. It's not possible to cover the whole in just a couple of minutes here, and I can't speak for all the invited guests, but at least for me it has been difficult to choose just a few spots to highlight here in this vast material. On the other hand, I'm pleased that this is a public event and that so many have come to participate today, since I think this project can be interesting far beyond the field of improvised music. The topic opens up to a much broader field, and I hope that the rest of you also will have the opportunity and time to later on dive into this large documentation of the project. So, the starting point for me have been to listen, and in the music I have discovered some typical areas I would like to discuss. As I said, the material is huge, and every area divides into several subtopics. However, the 5 areas in music in disorder that have particularly caught my attention are 1. Similarities, 2. Form versus content, 3. Complexity, 4. Presentation of artistic research, and 5. Future. The first one is about similarities between the actual instruments of the ensemble. This is a great quality in this music, that the boundaries between the instruments are blurred. They are seldom playing different roles in the overall structure. More often they resemble each other, blending together into a joint sound. This could be a desired result of this specific collective improvisation, yet I wonder if this may have been too much emphasis as derived from some of the chosen concepts and methods. From the text I have some examples, and the text I refer to here is this 100 pages that we have been reading, and some of it is on the website, and it will be in a book, I think, later on. So I have some pages here which I refer to, but I won't read the page number, but I will tell you about this. So the examples here is, you talk about influence with no domination, also mentioned by Åsa, intensive listening, permeability, disorder understood as more than order, transparency, no idiomatic boundaries. And it seems to me that all this together maybe have led the musicians into a much too polite and cautious mode. Maybe the concepts and methods here are amplifying each other and pushing the music too far away in this cautiousness. Having that said, these similarities are surely meant to be exactly like this, and in that way also well functioning. So that was the first, and I think maybe I can read all the 5 things, and then we can discuss together. Is it okay? Okay. So the second one is form versus content. The second area is also a quality in the music as I listen to it, yet kind of problematic. A focus shift in the process of the project is described as going from form to content, to perceive the music from inside out instead of the other way around. And this change is, of course, of great importance for developing the diagram and later on the rhizomatic scores, which are truly useful. The concept of connectors, which afford possibilities for variation in larger form aspects, is also in use here. But how come these different possibilities to larger forms are not more audible when listening to many pieces, as in the concert yesterday? To me, it seems that the pieces tend to not make use of the many different overall structures that these concepts give opportunities for. Maybe explore these possibilities later on in future concerts. And so the third one is about complexity. Complexity is a common word in the text, often connected to the word multi in various forms. Multi-layered, multi-temporal, multi-dimensional, but also, for example, to non-linear complexity, and most important, as a result of the above mentioned, to perceptual complexity. This is not at all something difficult to understand. It's more like a gift from the project to us who will listen and read. Music in Disorder is supporting, in a very generous way, our ability to perceive complexity in music and in text. And so, number 4, presentation of artistic research. In April 2016, the project was newly started and I was invited to respond to the first results. At that time, nothing had yet been decided about how this would be presented on the web. Now, the documentation is accessible in a very good way. So thank you for making this effort. I think this will be an inspiration for many regarding how to present artistic research. And so the last, 5th, future. Last I want to ask about the future. How are you planning to move on from here? Can this be placed in other contexts with this ensemble and or together with other musicians? In what way can these results be shared in a broader way, both with students, musicians, composers, and with other artists and other audiences? I hope that many more can explore music in disorder and take part of this knowledge. So, thanks for inviting me.
Let me see if this works. Is it working? Yeah. Thank you, Kim, for raising these interesting questions and also for your nice and supportive comments. I was thinking, first of all, the first point regarding cautiousness. Mm-hmm. I was just a bit curious about the other panelists. Is that also something that you felt or perceived in that way when listening?
No, I have not thought of it that way. When the 2 days of playing that we did not strike me as cautious, and this is why also I'm interested in this project as a development of a discursive voice, because I mean I know some of your playing from in other contexts, and you can sort of see how voices are negotiated. And I'm not sure it's a matter of cautiousness. I think it's a matter of listening and of establishing a certain kind of listening. And also, I think it might have to do, this might be a question, but I think it might have to do with the search for this order beyond order. And that there's actually an aesthetic goal that has sort of developed within the group towards a different kind of improvised music, which is beyond the sort of idioms of free improvisation in ways that, I mean, that sort of surpasses the voice of each individual performer, some of whom might be sort of situated normally more in that sort of free improv idiom. And yeah, that's my thinking and something that really interests me.
Well, I cannot compare, but I didn't think of cautiousness. But But I can agree with this idea of listening, because I can't remember when I've been listening so intensively as I did last night. And I think partly it was the arrangement, but partly because when you listen to each other, then that makes me also listen very much. So it's if I compare now to something, sometimes you can experience glorious moments of sort of virtuosic explosions or something like that, but it's a completely different gesture. In the text there is a lot of talk about affect, and we spoke a little bit at lunchtime that there, because this Deleuze and Guattari idea of affects and percepts, that's the task of art, is to produce affects and perceptions in a way. And for me as a non-musician and not very ear-oriented person, this total absorption into what is audible, what is hearable, the different sounds and the minuscule, sort of the, Erin Manning would speak of the infra-thin. It's really, so it cautious in the sense of sort of,
because I think this is a goal for you, and I think Rickard mentioned it very well in the text, because you said something about everything that everyone does is going to be audible. Everything has to be heard. So, of course, this is a result of that idea. So.
Yeah, and I also want to say that, I mean, we've talked a lot about domination and stuff, but it's also not about that we always avoid domination, but if it becomes a pattern, that could become a problem. That we talked a lot about. And I would say that the domination occurs sometimes, and we have talked a lot about roles and like stepping forward or backward, like in terms of the music. So I would say that this has happened, like in course of the project, that we have played with this spectrum of becoming more dominant or in front as a soloist, or becoming more accompanying. So that's also part of all this, but of course the collective sound is maybe more at the core, I would say.
Henrik?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like to point out again then the difference between listening and, I mean, listening as a listener and listen as a player. And now in this conversation here, where these are interchanged. But to me, it's hard to tell. I mean, I find it to be an absolute difference to be in a listener's listener or a player listener. Although the fact that I have played with you affects my listening to you, and in the playing with you, I did not perceive consciousness as such, but I can, as a listener, I can relate to that experience that Kim describes. And so I think, I mean, this is in a way, it is a question of how we deal with these different perspectives. And I'm at the point right now where I think it's really important to understand the difference. But I'm not completely, I don't know yet.
Yeah. Rickard, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I was thinking about what you're saying, and I think, Kat, you quite early in the project termed our playing as being affected by understatement. That we are, and that's an element we always have worked with. I think that has been with us the whole time, and it's about subtle tweaking. And why that is because then we don't lock ourselves into specific versions of the attractors or the resonators or the connectors you were mentioning, that the form aspect and the possibilities with the connector, for example, is there, but in order to keep it permeable and not dominating the musical landscape, we have to somehow treat it with an understated attitude, to keep it ambiguous and keep it in motion. Because if we were just to crisscross between different possibilities, very clear possibilities, that have been completely another idea. So this is not establishing very clear versions is definitely an object for us. Keeping it rhizomatic in that sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And as I said, I think this is a quality in your music that you have this. And I think ambiguity is the word here, which is really important for you to be able to do this music. So, yeah.
I'm interested in the conflictual possibility of non-cautious ambiguity, though, so I'm really glad that you brought that up. I was in New York a couple of months ago after spending a whole lot of time with this group, and then I went and played with these very hardcore free jazz musicians who definitely are not playing collectively, they're playing simultaneously. And this experience here kind of made me re-experience the total frustration I had as like a 20-year-old girl with a violin in that situation. And I actually approached it as if I were here, and I only played in this way for a really long time. And it was a forceful ambiguity because it made everything go back that way, you know, and that really surprised me. I didn't think that was going to happen. I thought I was going to sit back there and, you know, but it's slippery, but it is very possible to be too cautious. It's a really thin line, yeah, which it makes it interesting to try.
To me, it sounds like a very complex activity because I think. Now I'm talking about myself, but I mean, if you have a kind of method that's working, you would really like to go with that. It's easy because it's kind of confident. You're confident with that. So, I mean, it must be. We talked earlier about the process of unlearning, but I mean, this must be something you have to constantly deal with in order to achieve an unpredictability and kind of unconsciousness or whatever you call it. I don't know. It's not a question, actually. It's more a comment on it.
It's one of these things that's neither learning nor unlearning, but some third thing.
Yeah, I was thinking when we're talking about this, I mean, if there is also a tension between. Maybe it relates to what you said earlier, Henrik, about process and product or something like that. I mean, for me, maybe the overriding concern, in a way, at least in this project, has been to explore the collectivity, and that somehow requires this intensive listening and this responsiveness. Maybe I should add also permeability, which is a term that came up now several times, is something that we've been talking a lot about. In Swedish that would be genomsläpplighet. So how different musical materials or gestures or things like that can combine somehow. And that it could be any kind of materials, whether it's certain chords or melodies or sound, noise-based or anything like that. But there is some quality of how it's used that makes it permeable with something else. And that this, of course, is extremely difficult to nail down what that is. Because I think that's one of the maybe main components of an embodied knowledge that we have been working with, getting an intuition for what makes that happen, because it's a complex combination of volume, of density, of timing, of all these things to make pretty much any material be combinable with another. But because we are working with this, where the collectivity is the most important, I guess that has also consequences for how it sounds. I mean, it would be weird if it doesn't. And what that entails. For me, when I listen to back to our music, I feel that there is a certain kind of energy or intensity because of this collectivity, and that's really fascinating. Of course, I could go into thinking like, yeah, maybe it would have been nice if something like that would have happened, or something that, if from a composer's perspective, maybe it would be like, maybe it would be nice with some more variation, or we could do this or we could do that, because that would be really interesting. But it would probably, I'm just thinking spontaneously, that would probably also mean that intensity, that character of the collective creativity would be lost, because then we would have to go into some other kind of mode in order to accomplish that. So I'm a little bit curious also to hear, and maybe you want to follow up on that, but I'm a little bit curious to hear if you experience this, the collectivity, if that has a character in itself that kind of feels through the music, or if we don't focus on like what's actually happening musically, but is there something there that you perceive?
Yeah, I think so. And if I just can go back to because I think these concepts are magnifying each other because they are put together in this specific environment that you have. But also it gives rise to questions about how this collective is going to function. And I think it's really hard to predict what results could come out of putting these concepts together. So that's what I was more wondering about. So, but I think that this is really interesting because I can't answer the question. You maybe can or cannot now, but yeah.
But I think that's a really interesting, crucial question. How important the aesthetical result is.
Yeah. So I was just curious, also, if you want to. Okay.
Or even is the aesthetical result connected to the method? In other words, does this method give rise to an aesthetic, a musical aesthetic, which would imply then that there's an aesthetic in the schemas that you work with? Schemas, like? I mean, in the diagrams. Do they produce a certain result? Or is that open? Is there an openness between the diagram and the result, where your aesthetic comes in?
I think that it's the process that produces that, and that a different group of people using the process would come with a different sounding result, because they would have different backgrounds that they were pouring into these things. In a way, I mean, that's completely hypothetical, but yeah, there's a process piece to that, and there's a whole aspect of this project where the process is the result, and it must always be changing in order to reflect what we're talking about, which is improvisation. So it can't be static, and you can't have a static result, really. You can just have a picture of something in motion. And I guess as far as the variation question goes, I think it's actually just a matter of time. Like, just to go back to what you were saying, it's a matter of time. Like, that we would, if we keep going, that the variety will open in each of these things. And that's how it's worked so far anyway. Yeah, so then it isn't a matter of being able to sit down and make it happen. We actually have to wait for the process. It's very time-based. Yeah.
Yes, it would be interesting to mix a little bit now also between the auditorium and so if you have questions, maybe for the moment, if we can keep it kind of to the thematic that's going on, and then also we could open up for completely free questions a little bit later on. So you had a question or comment?
Well, it was regarding this ambiguity, or this Kim talking about this uncertainty that she felt, or hesitation. And I was wondering, I mean, you've been in this project for a long time, but also for me as a jazz musician, if I'm going back with my education, it wasn't like I had a project and it was like, yeah, but I was playing in certain kind of constellation in this same frame, and it was hours a day for years at end. And I'm guessing you're not having that kind of form here. You're coming together and trying this totally new concept together as a group, which you have a different experience in your baggage, but it becomes interpreted in this form in a new way. And my question is, do you think that it could be like you as a group get a more consensus on how you interpret these attractors and stuff the longer you're playing? Do you think it's gonna change the way your baggage is influencing your aesthetic? Is it gonna conform in a more streamlined thing if you keep on playing in this, like in a every week, every day kind of concept?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I first.
Yeah.
No, so we had an experience when we went on tour with a big group, the Octet, the first year of the project. The things happen that usually happens during tour, I think, with most material, that quite immediately development starts to like establish and crystallize, so that after 3 or 4 concerts, you're kind of experts in the material, and the group knows exactly, where to move and how things will develop, and you feel that's a really intense feeling of security and a certain kind of nice feeling somehow. So this was actually a great driving force, I think, to continue making the material more and more abstract, because we didn't want to go there. We wanted to go somewhere else.
We didn't want to have a nice feeling, actually.
No, that's
part of the project.
No, so we didn't. We wanted to go somewhere where it was more. It continued to be open-ended, and that safety net was somehow removed, and there were loose ends everywhere each time. So this is, I guess, the history of the attractor. That it's the material. It's still the material. Kat used to say that all this material is inherent in the attractors, but they're so abstracted, and we can't rely on anything that we will. So to answer your question, no, we don't want to arrive at the communal consensus about this. Precisely the opposite.
Because it was also about the question of the really intense listening, and for me, I feel nowadays when I play in a traditional jazz format, I don't know if it's lack of listening. It's more like I've done it so much that it's more of an instinct, and that's not possible here.
No. So, if you know what's going to happen, what's the use of listening? To paraphrase Picasso. Yeah. Hopefully that will not happen here.
Well, I mean, it depends on what we mean, I guess, with instinct and stuff. I mean, it could be intuition is at work in different ways. I would just like to add one thing. I think as a philosophical aspect, I think the attractors are trying to create these virtual spaces, these possibility spaces, and actually the more we would use these attractors or the other methods and always constantly varying them, creating new challenges of how to use them, that's how the possibility space opens up more. So it's actually the opposite, I would say. It's because when we started using certain of these methods, they would sound maybe more similar. But in the course of time of really opening up that space precisely through constantly varying finding new ways of varying. Now we haven't showed that map here, but we have these we call modulators, which are tools for doing this. So it's a weird thing. For me, it's interesting how something opens up that way and becomes, that's what we mean with the abstraction, the abstract aspect of it. And I think that's really an important thing also in any kind of pedagogical thinking. That's could be an important insight in a sense.
And at the same time, we have to respect the outside listener's perspective, that these subtle tweakings that we find, you know, that, oh, this was different. Yeah. I mean, for an outside listener, it might say, oh, that's kind of the same as last time. For us, it's something completely different. So we have to also respect that. Not all this subtle tweaking is getting across. I mean, most of it happens somewhere else in the system, and maybe the audible result could be interpreted as somewhat similar. But for us, it's dramatically different. So, yeah, it depends on the perspective.
Stefan, did you want to say something?
There was a question here.
Yeah?
Did you want to answer?
Thank you for a great, interesting talk and project. But, I mean, I actually thought about this cautiousness in many ways. First, you said that you were so different, you came from such different backgrounds. And to me, it was like, do they really do that? And secondly, it was about the instruments. They are very similar. And it's also kind of usual instruments in this kind of world. And I'm amateur, by the way, so I don't know what I'm saying, but I'm just saying spontaneous. And also when you play, it feels, I can understand the tweakings that you're talking about, and I feel the changes and the birds coming together and everything, but still I sense a bit of control. Maybe too much control, because you're so skilled at what you do, and I see what you're talking about, the different things that are kind of colliding, but at the same time I feel they're colliding in a controlled way somehow, just from this small experience. There's the friction, and so are you working somehow to create, like, it's like you're for left-wing people having a discussion that gets a little bit heated, but there's no Swedish Democrat there. And I'm not saying that it should be, but I'm just wondering if you're working with that sense of loss of control or friction, or or you get different opinions and you have to solve that live in the stage, like you have to tame the animal all of a sudden that you didn't expect, or something like that. Something like that. I don't know what I'm saying, but I'm trying to, maybe you do.
Thanks, interesting.
Well, can I? Yeah, well, yeah, of course. Well, I mean, we play all instruments that are part of a culture that we are in, and we have certainly very different kind of luggages and backgrounds. But I mean, we are I have no ambition or to leave this culture of, you know, improvised music listening, experimental sounds that we do together in a very refined and for me incredibly challenging and interesting way. I mean, if we would do that, that would be another project. I mean, if we would like to challenge really and have a non-Western music instrument here, or we had we have the scales that actually we have the quarter tones and so on, but we're not there. We are in this culture, so that's we wanted to.
Yeah. About the similarity of the instruments, this is not a classical violin in any way at all. Like, it looks like one, but it's detuned and it's a cheap instrument and this is broken, and yeah, it's not allowed in here in every respect. And like, but that's one of the subtle things, like, you know, and that electronic setup that Klaus is playing also doesn't fit into anything I've seen. Like, but it's subtle, you know.
I can tell that the violin that I'm playing on from my grandmother from 1680, I think she's rotating in her grave for that. Anyways.
But similarity is a relative thing.
Yeah. Stefan?
I wanted to return to Henrik's question about the diagram, whether the diagram is sort of the outcome of a certain aesthetic. And I think, interestingly, it is and it is not. Because I think the response to the question of what the future of this project could be lies in the ways in which the diagram can be the outcome of other constellations working, with similar kinds of processes. So it's back to this idea of sharing this practice and in what ways this can be done. And I think, and I thought it was very striking during the 2 days of collaborative work that we did, that a very important potential lies in cross-disciplinary collaboration. And I myself got extremely curious in what would happen if you put a playwright into the collaboration and see how you can think of performative language as something that can be generated through these kind of processes. And so that's where I see myself a real challenge also to the project, to see how far can this go. And it's also a way of taking it outside of the relative comfort zone of being these 5 great musicians who spent 3 years negotiating what you're now playing. And I think that would be a really beautiful thing to do. But in my opinion, it would need to be the group or members of the group starting this out, inviting long-term collaborations with artists from other disciplines. Do it. Great. So that's how I see it, because it's also a matter of the central knowledge being embodied by you. So just handing out the book and the website and say, well, here's the diagram model, use it, I think would not be as interesting as actually sharing the practice that you have and sort of spreading this knowledge that way. So this is what I was trying to say before, that this is something I think really essential for artistic research, for us to get our heads around how do we share this knowledge.
Yeah, I was thinking of. I think this question is very interesting for many reasons. One thing I'm thinking about is that, and it was also coming up here. It's these the subtleties, the subtle differences, and that's why I also prefer to see it as something micro-political. It's really in the micro details where some things can happen, and it's not always in the overt macro thing. So in a sense, if we get stuck in that idea that things can only happen when we put really opposites or take the very clear differences in identities or something, that's where it would happen. I think for me the power lies a lot in this specific intensive listening, where we have to be present with the smallest of details, and this is what I'm thinking at least, that this creates a certain kind of energy that also incites or challenges an external listener to do the same. Whether that's, I'm not sure for me that there's an absolute difference, but maybe there is between an external listener and an inside playing listener. But I'm curious about this quality that can come when we are wanting or willing to move into intense listening with the smallest of details, because in those smallest of cracks or something opens up, something that's non-unitary. So I actually wanted to pose a question to you, Åsa, about particularly this micro-political dimension, because I know that this is also something that you've been interested in, and also with similar inspiration. So how would you perceive that in this project? Maybe also in how you, perceive the music, and how you see these relations of the micropolitical and the aesthetics and the things we were talking about now.
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is. It's huge.
But personally find the greatness in this project does not necessarily have with any outside listeners' perspective, but I see it really that you're practicing transversality, and you're really working on destabilizing common subjectivities in improvisational practice, and I think the outcome is micropolitical, because whether the audience experience or not, because you're changing, you're changing something, you're creating something new, even though I'm not sure it might not be necessarily experienced immediately, but I think it's nevertheless it's a production of new aesthetic, creations or experiences. I think this was a very lousy answer, actually.
I liked it anyway. Anyone else?
So I think that coming back again, how do you share the practice of transversality as a kind of collective method? I think that is absolutely what I found really important.
Yes, of course.
Before you answer,
Very small comment, just because I just want to tell about the problem. But something that we have been so intense with this project, especially this last year, and it has given so many different musical inspiration also, outside of the project. And I had this crisis, I talked a little bit to you about it a few weeks ago, when I was going to play solo. How do I play solo now? How do I do? I'm just me. And it turned out to be fine, but it is something that of this sharing and listening to others, to get this kind of process of listening so intensely to the whole thing in the room that we create, that what the hell, I'm just going to be one voice. That's interesting. Which is interesting.
Yeah. Annette? Annette wanted to say something.
if you want to reply to this, please, because I'm going to say something completely different, so please.
I was just going to say that for me, Stefan and Henrik, when you came and played with us, and that we were trying to explain, and it really wasn't working, and then we couldn't make it clear until you put instruments in your hands, and then it was very fast. Is something that I think is going to be very key for. We've been talking about that a lot, and I think in terms of the future dissemination of the project, that it is something that has to be transmitted by playing, is an important part of how it is to be. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Just one little small thing. Yeah, and not just that we, when we have new people joining in the process, or we create new processes with new people, it's not about primarily us disseminating something, and explaining how to do this. We have to make sure that we rediscover the whole process with these new members.